Morning, my son-in-law told me I was no longer welcome in my own condominium. I was standing in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee I had just made. Not his coffee. Mine. The same French roast I had been buying for 30 years. My name is Agnes Calloway. I am 67 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that family was the one thing you could count on when everything else fell apart. I believed that because my husband Walter taught me to believe it. Walter spent 40 years believing it too. And then he died, and I learned that belief alone doesn't hold a family together. Behavior does, and behavior, turns out, is something you only truly see when the pressure gets high enough. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. Not the morning in the kitchen. Before that, years before that, Walter and I lived in Raleigh, North Carolina for most of our married life. We raised 2 children there. Our son Thomas, who lives in Denver and calls me every Sunday without fail, and our daughter Meredith, who is 41 years old, who has her father's green eyes and her father's quick laugh, and who, for reasons I still struggle to fully understand, stood in the living room of that condominium 6 months ago and said nothing while her husband told me to leave. But I need to tell you about the painting first, because without the painting, none of the rest of it makes sense. Walter collected things, not obsessively, not in the way that fills a house with clutter. He was selective, deliberate. He had a real eye for things that other people overlooked. Old maps, first edition novels nobody had heard of, and one Saturday afternoon about 11 years ago, he came home from an estate sale in Durham carrying a painting wrapped in an old moving blanket. It was not a large painting, maybe 18 inches by 24. An oil landscape, rolling hills, a gray sky, a farmhouse in the far left corner. The colors were muted. It looked like the kind of thing you might find in the back of an antique shop with a price tag that said $25. Walter paid $40 for it. He hung it in our bedroom, right across from the window. Sometimes I would catch him just standing there looking at it the way people look at something they love but can't quite explain. I asked him once what he saw in it. He smiled and said, "Patience." I never fully understood what he meant. I kept the painting anyway. When Walter passed away 3 years ago, the grief that followed was the kind that doesn't announce itself all at once. It arrived slowly, in small pieces: the empty side of the bed, the coffee maker set to brew for 2, the habit of turning to say something to someone who isn't there anymore. I moved through those first months the way you move through water. Everything felt heavier than it should have been. Thomas flew out from Denver twice in that first year. He wanted me to consider moving closer to him. But Meredith had a different idea. She and her husband had been living in a high-rise in Charlotte. Her husband, whose name is Preston, worked in commercial real estate. Meredith ran a small interior design business from home. They had a comfortable life, but Charlotte real estate is not cheap, and they had been talking about buying something larger for a while. Meredith came to visit me about 8 months after Walter died. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with that look on her face she's had since she was a teenager. The look that means she has already made a decision and is now working on convincing you it was your idea. "Mom," she said, "you shouldn't be rattling around in that house alone." I told her I was managing. She shook her head. "You're not managing. You're surviving. There's a difference." She wasn't wrong. I knew she wasn't wrong. What she proposed was this. There was a 2-unit condominium building in Charlotte's No-Da neighborhood. A developer had converted an old textile building into 4 units, and 2 of them on the same floor were still available. One was a larger 2-bedroom, one was a smaller 1-bedroom just down the hall. She and Preston would buy the larger one. I would buy the smaller one. We would be close, but we would each have our own space, our own front doors. "You won't be alone," Meredith said. "But you won't be in our way." I remember laughing at that last part. She laughed too. We both thought it was funny. The house in Raleigh sold in 3 weeks. Walter had kept it immaculate and the market was strong. After paying off what remained on the mortgage, I walked away with enough to buy the 1-bedroom unit outright, with a portion left over. I also used some of that money to help Meredith and Preston with their down payment, because the larger unit cost more than they could comfortably manage on their own. It wasn't a loan. I didn't ask for paperwork. They were my daughter and my son-in-law. I trusted them the way Walter had trusted family. That was my first mistake. The second was not being named on any of the documents for the larger unit. But at the time, I wasn't thinking about documents. I was thinking about Walter's empty chair. I was thinking about how much I wanted to be near my daughter. I was thinking about all the wrong things. The first year in Charlotte was genuinely good. Meredith and I walked to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. I babysat their dog, a nervous little terrier named Biscuit, when they traveled. Preston was polite at Thanksgiving and remembered to ask about my knee after my physical therapy appointments. Things were not perfect, but they were warm. They felt like family. It was somewhere in the second year that the temperature in the hallway between our two units began to drop. It started with small things. Preston began making comments about the building's shared expenses, the HOA fees, the parking situation, nothing directed at me specifically, but often mentioned in a tone that suggested I should be paying more attention. Then Meredith mentioned that she wished the common areas felt more consistent, which I eventually understood meant that she didn't like the welcome mat I had put outside my front door. I changed the mat. Then Preston started bringing up the subject of the condominium's value. Charlotte's Noda neighborhood had grown considerably since we moved in. Property values in the building had increased. He mentioned this frequently. At dinner, on the phone with Meredith when I could hear him through the wall, in the elevator when it was just the two of us and there was nothing else to talk about. One Sunday morning, Preston came to my door alone. Meredith was at a client meeting. He stood in my doorway with his arms crossed, not quite coming inside, not quite leaving. He had the manner of someone who had rehearsed what he was about to say. "Agnes," he started, "Meredith and I have been talking." "About what?" He looked past me at the living room for a moment. "About the building. About our situation here." I waited. "The market is really strong right now," he said. "We've been getting approached about selling." "Selling your unit?" "Potentially both units," he said. "As a package. Developers like acquiring full floors when they can." I set my coffee cup down slowly. "I'm not interested in selling." Preston smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know this is your home," he said, "and I respect that, but financially it might be worth considering." "I appreciate the thought," I told him, "but I'm not selling." He nodded, smiled again, left, smiled again, left. That should have been the end of it. But Preston, as I was learning, did not accept the end of things easily. Over the following weeks, the pressure became less subtle. Meredith began dropping comments about how the neighborhood was changing and how it might be a good time to think about a quieter location. She mentioned a senior living community in Concord, about 25 minutes outside Charlotte. She mentioned it once, then twice, then a third time with brochures. "I don't need a senior living community," I told her. "I'm 67, not 90. She gave me a look I recognized. It was the same look she gave the dog when he didn't sit on command. The real confrontation came on a Wednesday evening in February. I had made pot roast and brought a portion over to their unit because Meredith had mentioned she was exhausted from a difficult client project. Preston was home early. I knocked. Meredith opened the door, and the three of us sat at their dining table with the pot roast between us, and for a few minutes it felt completely normal. Then Preston put down his fork. "We need to talk about the long-term plan," he said. Meredith looked at the table. "We've been offered a significant amount for this floor," Preston continued. "Both units together, it's a number we can't ignore." "Then don't sell my unit," I said simply. "That's the issue." He leaned back in his chair. "Developers want the full floor. They won't take just ours without yours. Then the deal doesn't work," I said. Preston's jaw tightened slightly. "Agnes, we're trying to build our future here." "I understand that. I'm also trying to build mine." Meredith finally spoke, but what she said surprised me more than anything Preston had offered. "Mom, maybe it's just time for a change, for both of us." Both of us. As though I were the one asking her to move. I went back to my unit that night and sat in Walter's reading chair by the window. The painting was on the wall across from me, the same landscape, the same gray sky. And I thought about what Walter used to say, patience, but I also thought about something else. Because 3 days before that dinner, something had happened that I had not told Meredith or Preston about. something I hadn't told anyone, actually, because it still didn't feel entirely real. I had received a letter. The letter came from an art research firm in New York. A woman named Dr. Preston, Lena Okafor, who specialized in provenance authentication, wrote to inform me that a painting matching the description of one registered in Walter's name had come to their attention during research connected to an estate collection review. She had traced the piece's possible origin to a German expressionist painter named Heinrich Brandt, who was moderately well known in European auction circles and largely unknown in the American market. She wanted to arrange an examination. I remember reading that letter 4 times in a row. Then I folded it, put it back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer under my silverware. It seemed impossible. Walter had paid $40 for that painting. Walter, who had wonderful taste and absolutely no luck with investments. It seemed like the kind of thing that happened to other people. So I put it in the drawer and went about my week and tried not to think about it too much. The morning Preston told me I was no longer welcome, I had forgotten about the letter entirely. It was a Thursday. I woke up at 6 the way I always do. I made coffee. I stood by the kitchen window and watched the street below come to life. And then I heard a knock at my front door. Preston was standing in the hallway, dressed for work, looking like a man who had made a decision and wanted to deliver it before his day got complicated. Agnes, Meredith and I talked last night. We've decided to move forward with the sale, both units. I told you I'm not selling. Your unit is technically listed as an independent sale, he said. But our ability to complete our transaction depends on both units being available. Preston, I said slowly, my name is on the deed to my unit. You cannot sell my home. He didn't even blink. We're not selling your home, we're informing you that the arrangement we had isn't working anymore, and we'd like you to consider making other plans. I stared at him. Meredith agrees, he added. Let me speak to Meredith. She's asleep. Then wake her up. Preston's expression shifted into something patient and unmovable, the way a bureaucrat looks when they've already decided the answer is no. We've discussed it thoroughly. She agrees it's time. He left before I could say anything else, and I stood in my own kitchen, in my own condominium in a building I had helped pay for, and I thought, this is the moment Walter would have known exactly what to say. I didn't know what to say. So I went and found Dr. Termans. Okafor's letter. She answered on the second ring. I told her I was ready for the examination. The authentication process took 11 days. A specialist from her firm came to Charlotte, handled the painting in white gloves, photographed it under specialized lighting, took 2 small fiber samples from the back of the canvas. He was careful and quiet and professional, and when he left he said he would be in touch. I didn't tell Meredith. I didn't tell Thomas. I sat with it alone, the way Walter had always sat with things he wasn't ready to share yet. He used to say that some news needed time to become real before it could be given away. Meanwhile, the pressure from Preston did not stop. He sent me a formal letter, drafted by someone in his office, outlining his position that my continued occupancy was disrupting a pending transaction. The language was cold and impersonal. The word occupancy, applied to my home, made my hand shake. I called my oldest friend. Her name is June Whitfield. We have known each other since our children were in elementary school together. June is 72, still sharp as a tack, and she has the particular quality of saying exactly what she thinks without making you feel foolish for not having thought of it first. He sent you a letter, she repeated when I read it to her. Yes. Using the word occupancy. Yes. About your own home. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Agnes, do you have a lawyer? I did not have a lawyer. Well, she said, you're going to need one. June came over the following afternoon. She brought tomato soup and cornbread and sat across from me at my kitchen table while I pulled out every document I had, the original purchase agreement, my bank records showing the wire transfer for my unit, and the bank record showing the separate transfer I had made toward Meredith and Preston's down payment. June looked at those last records carefully. This is documented, she said. It was a gift. Was it? She looked up. Did you sign anything saying it was a gift? Did they? I thought about it. No. Then it's just a transfer, she said simply. And transfers have legal implications. I hadn't considered that. I had been so focused on the hurt of the situation that I hadn't stopped to think about what the paperwork actually showed. June found me a real estate attorney named Howard Park. His office was downtown on the 14th floor of a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and quiet competence. He was thorough. He asked good questions, and when I showed him the documents, he leaned back in his chair and said something that I have thought about many times since. Mrs. Calloway, your son-in-law is operating under the assumption that you have no leverage here. He is incorrect. The letter Howard sent to Preston arrived the following Tuesday. I know because Meredith called me at 8:15 that morning. She did not sound like herself. She sounded like someone who had just stepped off a moving sidewalk. Mom, what is this? It's a letter from my attorney. Your attorney. She repeated the words as though they were from another language. Since when do you have an attorney? Since your husband sent me a letter about my occupancy. There was a long pause. Mom, we need to talk. I agree. She came over that evening without Preston. She sat on my sofa and she looked, for the first time in a long time, like my daughter instead of Preston's wife. There was no script, no agenda. She just looked tired. I didn't know he sent you that letter, she said. But you agreed I should go. She looked at her hands. He said it would be better for everyone. He said the same thing when he told me. Meredith rubbed her forehead. I know how it sounds. How does it sound? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than I expected. It sounds like I chose him over you. I let that sit between us for a moment. I also helped pay for your home, I said finally. That money I gave you for the down payment. That was real money, from the sale of the house where I raised you. She looked up. I know. Your attorney husband apparently did not factor that into his letter. Meredith put her face in her hands. He thought it was a gift. It was, I said, but gifts made under specific circumstances to family members for the purchase of property don't always stay clean when lawyers start asking questions. Howard explained that to me. She looked at me over her fingertips. You were serious about all this. I live here, Meredith. This is my home. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that surprised me. I'm sorry, Mom, I mean that. It was the first honest thing anyone in that household had said to me in months. Dr. Okafor called the following Friday morning at 9. I was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, still in my robe. Walter's painting was on the wall in the living room, visible from where I sat. I had been looking at it more than usual lately. Mrs. Calloway, she said, I had the results of the authentication. I put down my coffee cup. The painting in your possession is consistent in all authenticated markers with the work of Heinrich Brandt. The canvas fiber, the pigment composition, the brushwork technique, and the provenance documentation we were able to trace through the estate collection all support the conclusion. I waited. We believe it to be an original Brandt, she said, one that has not appeared in any public auction record for over 60 years. What does that mean in terms of value? Dr. Okafor paused. Based on recent brand sales and European options and the rarity of this particular period of his work, our preliminary estimate is between $1.2 and $1.8 million. I looked at the painting. Walter had paid $40. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after she finished speaking, not because I didn't understand what she had said, but because I was thinking about Walter standing in that estate sale in Durham, holding that wrapped canvas, smiling his quiet smile. I thought about him carrying it to the car, unwrapping it in the bedroom, hanging it on the wall and stepping back to look at it. Patience. He had known. I was suddenly certain he had known. I made myself a second cup of coffee before I called Thomas. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been worrying about me. I told him everything, about Preston's letter, about Howard, about the financial dispute, and then I told him about Dr. Okafor. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're telling me Dad found $1 million painting at an estate sale. Closer to 1.8 potentially. He laughed. Then I laughed. And for a few minutes we were just two people who had loved the same man and were somehow still being surprised by him years after he was gone. Don't tell anyone yet, Thomas said when we had composed ourselves. I know. especially not Meredith. I know Thomas. And get Howard to help you figure out the next steps. Howard already had thoughts about the next steps. We spoke that afternoon. Given that the painting had belonged to Walter, it had passed to me as part of his estate. The authentication needed to be formally documented. A sale, if I chose to pursue one, would take time. But the value was real and it was mine. Howard also had thoughts about the ongoing dispute with Preston regarding the financial contribution I had made to their unit. These are two separate matters, Howard said, but they are related in one important way. What way? Your son-in-law has been operating under the assumption that you are financially limited. That assumption is going to change. 2 weeks later, Meredith and Preston requested a meeting. Howard accompanied me. We sat in a conference room at Howard's office, 4 of us at a rectangular table with a water pitcher in the center that no one touched. Preston had brought his own attorney, a man named Gary Sills, who seemed to be trying to look more relaxed than he felt. Preston's position had shifted considerably since the letter. He no longer talked about occupancy or pending transactions. He talked about misunderstandings. He talked about the stress they had been under. He talked about how much Meredith valued our relationship and how this had all gotten out of hand. Howard let him talk. Then Howard placed the financial records on the table. The wire transfers, the timing, the amount. Preston and Gary exchanged a look. Those funds were understood to be a gift, Preston said. That understanding was never documented, Howard replied. It was a family arrangement, which is now subject to legal review, Howard said, specifically as it relates to any proceeds from the sale of that unit. The color in Preston's face changed slightly. Meredith was not looking at Preston, she was looking at me. The meeting lasted an hour and a half. By the end of it, an arrangement had been outlined. If Meredith and Preston sold their unit, a portion of the profit would reflect my financial contribution to the purchase. The calculation was specific and documented. Preston signed the preliminary agreement without much argument, which told me Howard had calibrated things correctly. What Preston did not know, what neither of them knew, was the painting. That piece of information was still folded quietly in my chest, the way Walter used to fold things he wasn't ready to give away yet. The following month, I accepted an offer from a private art dealer in New York that Dr. Minam O'Coffer had connected me with. The sale took time to process: authentication documents, transfer paperwork, legal clearances. But when the wire transfer arrived in my account, the number on the screen was $1.4 million. $1.4 million. From a $40 painting Walter bought on a Saturday afternoon because something in his chest said yes. Meredith and Preston sold their unit 6 weeks after our meeting at Howard's office. The market did exactly what Preston had predicted it would do. They made a significant profit. My share of that profit, per the agreement, arrived through Howard's office shortly after. I did not call Meredith to discuss it. I let the process complete itself the way Walter would have. Quietly, without drama. It was Thomas who suggested the dinner. He flew in from Denver specifically for it. He made the reservation himself at a restaurant in Dilworth that Meredith and I had always liked. The 4 of us sat at a corner table: Thomas, me, Meredith, and Preston, who was trying very hard to be pleasant and nearly succeeding. We talked about Thomas's kids. We talked about a trip Meredith wanted to take. We talked about the neighborhood we had all just moved out of, and the way Preston described it now you would have thought it was his favorite place on earth. Toward the end of dinner, Meredith reached across the table and touched my hand. "I want you to know I'm glad things worked out the way they did," she said. "Are you?" I asked. She looked genuinely uncertain for a moment. "Yes. I just wish we had handled the beginning better." I thought about what to say to that. I thought about the morning Preston stood in my doorway before his workday. I thought about Meredith asleep while he delivered his message. I thought about the word occupancy. "I appreciate that," I said. Preston cleared his throat. "Agnes, I owe you an apology. I was thinking about the transaction and not about the people involved." It was the most honest thing he had said in 2 years. Thomas raised his water glass. "I think Dad would have found this whole situation very entertaining." Meredith laughed. That surprised me. Her laugh still sounds like his. "There's something else I should probably tell you both," I said. Thomas was already smiling. He knew. Meredith looked at me. "What?" I took a small breath. "You know Walter's painting? The landscape. The one that hung in our bedroom all those years. The one you moved to Charlotte? Meredith asked. Yes, what about it? It's an original work by a German expressionist named Heinrich Brandt. Meredith frowned slightly, not recognizing the name. It sold last month, I said, for $1.4 million. The table went completely quiet. Preston set down his fork. Meredith looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was a child, discovering something that rearranged her understanding of the world. Dad bought that at an estate sale, she said slowly. For $40, Thomas added helpfully. 1.4, Preston repeated, in a voice that was barely audible. Yes. Meredith started laughing again. Not the polite dinner table laugh from a moment ago. A real one, the kind that fills your chest. Of course he did, she said. Of course Dad would do that. And I found myself laughing too, because she was right. Of course Walter would. That was exactly the kind of thing Walter would do. After dinner, Thomas walked me to my car. The Charlotte evening was warm, the kind of April night that smells like cut grass and somewhere nearby someone is grilling. Thomas put his arm around my shoulders. You doing okay, Mom? Better than okay. He looked at me carefully. You know Meredith feels terrible. I know. Preston too, in his way. I know that too. Thomas was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do with the money? I had already decided. The Robert Davis Foundation had nothing to do with my life, so instead I had been thinking about something Walter used to support quietly, a literacy program at the public library in our old neighborhood in Raleigh. He had donated to it for years small amounts, the way he did everything without announcement. I wanted to give them something larger, something that would last. I'm going to do something Walter would have approved of, I said. Thomas nodded. That sounds right. I drove home to a new condominium I had found on my own, in a part of Charlotte I had always liked, with a second bedroom where Thomas could stay when he visited and a wall by the window where I had already decided the painting's successor would hang. Not another landscape. Not yet. Something Walter hadn't chosen. Something that was mine. That night, sitting in my reading chair with a glass of wine and the city lights coming through the window, I thought about the morning on the doorstep. About Preston's measured voice. About the word occupancy. About sitting in my kitchen afterward, pulling Dr. Okafor's letter out of the silverware drawer. People ask what you would do if your own family turned on you, if the people you trusted with your money and your future and your daily proximity decided one morning that you were a problem to be solved. I can tell you what I did. I found the letter I had been ignoring. I called the woman I should have called months earlier. I called my oldest friend. I called a lawyer. I sat still long enough to understand what I actually had before I gave anyone else the chance to define it for me. Walter always said the thing people underestimate most is what's already in their possession. He was talking about the painting. He was also talking about something else. I understand that now, and if you're sitting somewhere right now thinking about something you've been putting in a drawer, something that feels too uncertain to act on, something you're waiting to become real enough to share, I want you to consider that it might already be real. You might just need someone in white gloves and good lighting to confirm what you already knew. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you would have done. Because I read every single one of your comments, and every story you share reminds me that mine is never as singular as it feels in the middle of it. Like the video if it stayed with you. And if you believe that the things we overlook are sometimes the most valuable ones, then you already understand exactly what Walter knew when he walked out of that estate sale carrying a painting wrapped in an old moving blanket. Some things are worth more than anyone gave them credit for, including us. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened in that condominium. Not the legal part of it, not the money part, the human part, the part that started long before Preston ever drafted that letter with the word occupancy in it. What I keep coming back to is this. Preston didn't do anything sudden. He did something gradual. He applied pressure in the direction he believed I couldn't push back against. That's not a villainous move exactly. It's a miscalculation. He looked at a 67-year-old widow and he calculated that she was finished accumulating, that everything of value she had was already spent or given away. And once you believe that about a person, it becomes very easy to treat them like a problem rather than a person. That miscalculation cost him. Not because I outsmarted him. I didn't sit down and plan anything. I found the letter I had been ignoring. I called June. I called Howard. I let the truth of the situation catch up to the story Preston had decided to tell himself. That's the thing about choosing not to see someone clearly. Reality doesn't adjust to match your version of it. It just waits. Meredith is harder for me to think about, honestly, because she is my daughter and I know her. I know that she is not a cruel person. She is a person who learned somewhere along the way that keeping peace in her marriage meant going quiet when Preston set the direction. That's not strength. It looks like loyalty, but it isn't. Real loyalty would have been her standing in that hallway and saying, "That's my mother, and I'm not doing this." It would have cost her something. She chose not to pay it. And I had to sit with that. I still sit with it sometimes. What I've decided is that forgiveness and clarity can live in the same place. I forgave Meredith. I also stayed clear-eyed about what happened. Those two things don't cancel each other out. You can love someone and still name honestly what they failed to do. That kind of honesty is not cruelty. It's actually what makes repair possible. Walter used to say that most people never find out what they're worth because they let someone else do the appraisal. He was talking about the painting, probably. He found that thing at an estate sale for $40 because he trusted his own eye when everyone else had walked past it. That's not luck. That's a practiced refusal to let other people's indifference set the value of what you're looking at. I think about that now when I think about what I almost let happen. I almost let Preston's letter be the final word. I almost let his version of my situation become the real one. And if I had, I would have moved into some quiet community in Concord, and the painting would have stayed on my wall, and Dr. Okafor's letter would have stayed in the silverware drawer, and none of the rest of it would have existed. The only thing that changed everything was deciding that I got to be the one who determined what I had, not Preston, not Meredith, me. That decision is available to anyone. It doesn't require money. It doesn't require winning anything. It just requires the willingness to look at your own life with the same patience and clear eyes Walter brought to that estate sale on a Saturday afternoon in Durham. Some things are worth more than anyone gave them credit for, including the person holding them.